Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Some Stops Along the Way. I'm Mark McCord. This is your podcast that highlights some of the most interesting countries in the world through the lens of my work in those countries, but also focuses on their history, their culture, and their geopolitics. Today, as I announced last week, we've got a special report. We're not going to talk about a country today, though I hope that you enjoyed our last episode on the fascinating country of Sri Lanka. But we're going to talk about an institution that touches virtually every country in the world, 193 or so countries that are member states in the United Nations. So we're going to talk about that in this episode and whether or not the United Nations is still an effective mechanism for dialogue around the world. But before we do that, I want to do a few other things. First of all, I want to remind you that my new novel, The Ghost of Mariupol, is out. It's available on Amazon. All the proceeds from the sale of this novel go to the Ukraine Society of Indiana for their work in support of the heroic people of Ukraine and also for their work to create visibility about the Ukrainian situation. So I hope you'll grab a copy of this. It's a great story, but you'll also be helping the Ukrainian people. So I hope that you will do that. Of course, there's my memoir, Some Stops Along the Way, which is the compendium for this podcast. Gives you a lot of backstory information that I think will interest you. And another book I have out now is The Unfinished Continent, which dissects literally decades of foreign assistance to Africa, what it has bought, the impact it's created, the successes that this aid has produced, the failures, and the new direction that I believe that foreign assistance should move on the continent of Africa, which will give agency to the African people and allow them to create strong economies, strong governance systems, and a way of life that is indicative to the extraordinarily fantastic continent that this is. So hope you'll grab a copy of The Unfinished Continent. It is available in paperback or hardback. The Ghost of Mariupol is available in paperback and in electronic version on Kindle. They're all available on Amazon. Okay, we're going to jump into this episode. By the way, you probably noticed my very orange shirt today. This is Oklahoma State Cowboys, go Pokes. I've alienated now all my OU fans out there, but it's all Oklahoma guys. So hopefully we can all get along, except for those Saturdays when Oklahoma plays Oklahoma State in football. At any rate, want to move forward with this discussion of the United Nations, and I want to start with a caveat because I believe in transparency. And I want to be very honest with you today. And those of you who know me well already know this because you've heard my rants before. I'm not going to rant today. I'm going to try not to rant today. But I'm not a fan of the United Nations. And I haven't been for a very long time. But it's probably not for the reason that you think or the reason that many people who are not fans of the United Nations extol. It has nothing to do with political leanings. It doesn't matter to me whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, whether you are, in European terms, a conservative or a a liberal or left or right or center, whatever you are, doesn't matter. I don't care about the politics of the situation when it comes to this particular issue. The reason that I have an issue with the UN is that I've seen what's happening on the ground, or more importantly, what's not happening. And that's the biggest issue I have. I used to do a lot of speaking on this particular topic, and I would interject something in my speeches that was not widely appreciated sometimes, but I'll share it with you. And I said that the acronym for the UN stands for unnecessary. And that's tongue in cheek, of course, because I truly think that a body like the United Nations is necessary, and that the goals and aspirations that the United Nations had at its inception are not only laudable, but critical for the world. And I think that there are things that the United Nations does extraordinarily well. There are many things that the United Nations mangles very badly, whether on purpose or by accident. But I'm not the quintessential United Nations hater because I believe that its politics are wrong. Although in many cases I believe they are. And I'm not a hater of the United Nations at all. I simply don't agree with the direction the United Nations has gone. I believe that it strayed from its original mission. And I believe that, quote unquote, fixing the United Nations at this point in time is almost impossible. But to really understand the United Nations and how to put it in the context of being able to determine its current and future effectiveness, we really have to understand how it came to be and many of the aspects surrounding this global institution. The UN is a multifaceted organization. It is a huge organization. And so it's very important to start at the beginning, to take away enough layers of the onion to really understand what the role of the UN was to be in the beginning and how it has evolved into what it is now. So we're going to explore how the UN came to be, how it's funded, where it succeeded, where it's failed, and why the United States plays such an outsized role in keeping the lights on, so to speak, at the United Nations. We'll also look at what happens when countries don't pay their dues. And yes, there are quite a few who fall behind, and it's not just the United States. Because we're the largest economy in the world, the United States, United States lack of payment to the United Nations, especially over the last several years, has made international headlines. But there are many countries who are behind in their dues to the United Nations. And then we're going to tackle the big question. Is the UN still relevant? Or has it become so bureaucratic and political that it can no longer achieve its goals? So let's dive into this by looking at the birth of the United Nations. So, the first thing that we need to understand is that the United Nations was born out of catastrophe. After two world wars in less than 30 years, global leaders realized that the world needed a permanent forum, a place where nations could talk instead of fight. In 1945, representatives from 50 countries met in San Francisco and drafted the United Nations Charter. Their goals were sweeping. First of all, to maintain international peace and security, to promote pardon me, to promote human rights, to foster social and economic development, to uphold international law, and to provide humanitarian aid. Was it idealistic? Yes. Was it ambitious? Goes without saying. But it was also absolutely necessary because the world as we know it at that time was broken. And countries needed a different way forward in dealing especially with their conflicts. So the United Nations officially came into existence on October the 24th, 1945, a date now celebrated as United Nations Day. But ideals alone don't keep an organization running. From the very beginning, the UN needed money. And that's where things, let's just say, got interesting. So let's look at how the UN is funded. The UN's funding system is unique. And by unique, I mean complicated enough to make your accountant weep. I know people who've been in the UN system their entire lives, and they could not even come close to explaining to you how the funding for the United Nations work, let alone how to try to access the funding, which is another story entirely. There's bureaucracy, there's soul-sucking bureaucracy, and then there's UN bureaucracy. And we'll talk about that. But this convoluted way that the UN is funded has been the nexus of a lot of angst and a lot of debate. So I'm going to try to break it down as easily for you as I can. Because if I tried to go into detail, number one, I would get lost because I don't understand every aspect of UN funding as well. But also, it would give you a migraine, and I don't want to do that. So I'm going to focus on the basic elements. The UN has really two types of budgets. It has its regular budget, which covers the core operations of the United Nations, the General Assembly, the Security Council, the Secretariat, and its basic administrative functions. And then it has another budget called the peacekeeping budget, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But in the regular budget, every member state pays into the budget based on a formula that considers its national income, its economic conditions, and its ability to pay. Okay, now let's stop right here for a minute. Every member state pays into the budget based on this formula, this three-pronged formula, of which national income is one. I can buy into that. The bigger, more prosperous country you are, the more you should pay to have access to this dialogue body to work out global issues. Because no issues are unilateral anymore. Countries, of course, have autonomy to make their own decisions, but those decisions have consequences. And those decisions have tentacles that go all over the world. So this dialogue is very, very important. So providing funding by national income, I'm with you. But then we get into these other two elements that are very subjective. National income is very objective. It's easy to track. This country is producing this amount of GDP. It's this size, this population, economy's going well, this is what it pays. But when you get into the ability to pay in the economic conditions, this is very much more subjective. Okay? So let's say that a country is a large country, it's a strategic country, it's a country that very much needs to be part of the United Nations. But for some reason, it's having an economic crisis and it doesn't have the ability to pay. Should it still have access to this dialogue body? Or what if it has an overarching economic condition like Greece did several years ago, where its debt almost created a implosion of the economy? Should it still have access? The ability to pay is one thing. Everybody understands if you can't afford it, you can't afford it. Understood. But should you still have the same access? And that goes for the United States as well, by the way. Who can afford to pay? We just, at this present time at least, are choosing not to. And that price tag is high, and I'll talk to you about it in just a moment. But when you factor in all three of these elements, this is why the United Nations is constantly trying to gather resources. Okay? You need to understand something. And maybe this is clear to you, maybe it's not, but I want to make it clear. The United Nations has no money on its own. It does not generate money. It's not a business. It doesn't generate profit. It is solely dependent on its member countries to pay the bills. Okay? The United States is the world's largest economy, and it pays the largest share of UN dues into the regular budget. About 22% of the budget comes from of the entire United Nations and all of its member states comes from the United States of America. So if the United States doesn't pay, it puts a massive hole in the UN ship, and we'll talk about that in a few moments. But I said there were two primary budgets: this operational budget and the peacekeeping budget. The peacekeeping budget's separate, and it's much larger. The peacekeeping budget requires troops, logistics, equipment, and long-term deployments. And countries contribute based on a different formula, with wealthier nations paying more and developing nations paying less. The United States, once again, pays the largest share at about 27%. The UN budget is large. We'll talk about how large in just a few moments, but it is a massive, massive institution. And the United States does, in fact, pay a disproportional amount of funding to the United Nations. Now, one can argue that the UN is located in the United States, so there is a quote-unquote obligation to pay. That has been a matter of debate in recent years. There have been threats by the United Nations that if the United States doesn't pay its dues that are in arrear, that it will move the United Nations somewhere else. Most recently, I heard to Nairobi, which in my mind is farcical. And just the cost of moving the United Nations would be so massive that it's almost incredible that an institution who is already saying they're strapped for money would even consider moving somewhere else and having to uproot its entire governance mechanism and put a burden on its financial structure to be able to do that. But again, if in fact that would ever happen, it would depend on another country or countries to pay the bill, because the United Nations has no money on its own. It pays bills because it gets money from its member states. So beyond these two budgets, the United Nations also has other funding streams that are more or less pass through. They receive money from voluntary contributions to agencies like UNICEF, the World Health Organization, and the United States Humanitarian Council for Refugees, UNHCR, as examples. And this money is paid through the United Nations and then apportioned to those organizations. World Food Program is another one. But in looking at these institutions as well, these connected institutions, if you will, like UNICEF, WHO, UNHCR, World Food Program, they are endemic of what I believe is wrong with the UN system as a whole. I mean, for instance, the World Food Program, they're good at doing one thing. They move food fast. They address needs that are there, usually in times of famine or natural disasters. Do not be under the illusion that the World Food Program is providing people the way to grow more food or to solve the issue of world hunger. Please don't be under that illusion. And quite frankly, they don't even see it as their mandate. I had a very long argument in the past with a person that I respect that runs one of the World Food Program offices in Africa. And she stated up front, growing food's not my issue. Just don't care. We provide food to people who need food. That's what we call treating the symptom. And the thing about treating the symptom is this: you never cure the disease. You continually spend more money addressing the symptom, but the disease is still there. What are the reasons why people are hungry? What's the root problem? Solve the problem. World Food Program doesn't do that. And I would argue, on a larger scale, the United Nations doesn't do it. Let's look at UNICEF. UNICEF is one of the most bureaucratic organizations that you can find. And it does virtually nothing to facilitate the long-term protection of children because it doesn't have either the mandate or the authority to do that. It can cajole, it can advise, it can try to intervene, but at the end of the day, countries do what they do. And it has no policing body, it has no authority to address this issue. And yet it collects massive amounts of cash that pass through the United Nations and are spent on various and sundry things to benefit children, many of which I've personally seen don't work. Let me give you an example. When we lived in Romania, Debbie was involved with a major hospital there that was administering, that was taking care of babies who were born, and from day one they needed to be adopted because their families had given them up. And at that time, I can't speak to current times, but at that time, there were massive numbers of children that needed to be adopted. And many of them were being adopted by people in Western Europe and the United States. Until the new head of the UNICEF office in Romania decided that that was somehow averse to the culture of Romanians and encouraged the Romanian government, badgered them, bullied the Romanian government into stopping foreign adoptions in a country that at that time had very few orphanages, very little ability to deal with the orphan crisis, especially that came out of the Ceausescu years. And it was leaving aside a massive number of people in Western Europe and the United States especially that could give these orphans a productive and beautiful life and still retain elements of their culture. Debbie was furious at this, and I can't blame her, because this lady who was head of the UNICEF office was absolutely misguided. For whatever her reasons, whether they were altruistic or whether she was friends with someone in the government that wanted this to stop, who knows? But it was a wrong-headed decision that damaged the country and especially damaged those children that she supposedly was so concerned about. And I've seen UNICEF do things like this over and over and over around the world. The World Health Organization, another one of these connected organizations to the United Nations, that is really an example of the overall system that is broken. You don't have to get me started on the World Health Organization. It's slow, it's cautious. You can look at its COVID-19 response and see how marginalized the WHO was. Here's an organization that's supposed to be some of the most sophisticated health professionals in the world who had no clue how to address COVID-19, who gave so many different opinions and different directions that no one could make sense of it at all. And yet they're using COVID-19 now as a way to raise more money. So these voluntary contributions to organizations like this come through the United Nations. United Nations also has specialized program funding. They do receive private donations as well. And they have partnerships with NGOs and foundations around the world. In other words, the UN is a financial mosaic. That is a nice way to put it. A financial black hole is another way to put it. So how big is the UN budget? Let's talk numbers. The UN's regular budget today is roughly $3 billion a year, and that's in this first budget that I talked about, this operational budget. The peacekeeping budget is around $6 to $7 billion a year. These are numbers with a B, not an M. $3 billion a year, roughly, for operations administrations. The peacekeeping budget, $6 to $7 billion a year, and these budgets have been reduced slightly over the years, but they've pretty much bottomed out over the last few years at these numbers. Over the last 20 years, UN's core operating budgets hovered in the low single-digit billions, around 3 to 4 billion, while the wider UN system, including the humanitarian development agencies that I talked about, this UNHCR, UNICEF, um, World Health Organization, etc., has grown to $50 to $60 billion a year. Okay, 50 to 60 billion. So you have about 3 billion or so in that operations budget. That's a first budget. You have 6 to 7 billion in the peacekeeping budget. So that's around 10 billion. So you have between 40 and 50 billion dollars a year that is flowing to these other humanitarian and development agencies. The core UN is relatively small, but the broader UN family is where most of the money and activity now sit. So let's put this into perspective. The UN budget is when aggregated together, it's around 50 to 60 billion a year. The budget in New York City is over $100 billion. The budget of the U.S. Department of Defense is over $800 billion. The UN's entire annual budget is roughly the cost of one modern aircraft carrier. So I know the numbers sound big, but let's not blow this out of proportion. There are a lot of institutions that are bigger than the United Nations. Okay? I don't have an issue with the budget. I never have. I have an issue with how it's spent. Okay? It doesn't matter. The size of the budget doesn't even matter to me as long as the countries are willing to pay. Because again, United Nations generates no cash on its own. My problem is what they do with the money. And the bureaucracy and the waste and the absolute disregard for common sense that the UN uses in distributing funds from their member governments. And remember something, these member governments don't have money either. Where's their money coming from? It's coming from their people through tax dollars, etc. Now, certainly there are things coming from tariffs. Their governments have other revenues. But ultimately, it's the people in these countries that are paying the bills. And those countries are taking a portion of that money and giving it to the United Nations. So when the United Nations waste money, or they absolutely lose their mind and spend money recklessly, that's taking money out of the pockets of people in countries that need those funds, where those funds could be used to benefit the people themselves. So, what's the U.S. contribution? This is the elephant in the room. As I said, the United States is the single largest financial contributor to the United Nations. I mentioned that the U.S. pays 22% of the UN's regular budget, or its operational budget. The U.S. pays about 27% of its peacekeeping budget. Why so high? Well, it's based on this formula that I talked about. It's economic size. And the U.S. economy is enormous. So what happens if the United States doesn't pay? And it's not a secret to anyone that the United States is in arrears. Hundreds of millions of dollars in arrears. And the current administration is quite likely not to pay it at all. But this is not the first time that the United States has been in arrears. So, what happens? When the U.S. withholds its dues, peacekeeping missions struggle to operate. Agencies delay hiring and freeze programs. Humanitarian operations scale back. The UN accumulates debt. And other countries do not make up the difference. Pardon me. Think about that last statement. The United States doesn't pay. That doesn't mean the other countries pay more. They don't step up and address the issue. It simply puts a hole in the United Nations budget. It's not like a gym membership where someone else covers your fee. If the United States doesn't pay, the UN simply has less money. And because the U.S. is such a large contributor, even partial withholding can cause major disruptions. We need to understand, though, that the United States is not the only country behind on its dues. Every year, several countries fall behind because of economic hardship, political instability, sanctions, administrative failures, deliberate political protest. Countries that fall too far behind can lose their vote in the General Assembly, though exceptions are made for nations facing genuine crisis. This is an interesting aspect about the United Nations, is that they talk a great game. They say a lot of things. They make a lot of juxtapositions. They even throw down ultimatums. And yet, when push comes to shove, are you really going to tell a country like the United States, no, you haven't paid your dues, so don't show up? Can't help you. Especially when countries like China and Russia have great issues on their own. And do we want them being major players and setting policy for the world? It's ludicrous. The United States doesn't pay or hasn't paid because it has grave reservations. And I'm stating what the current administration U.S. administration has espoused. It has grave reservations with the United Nations actions and its mandate. But also, we need to look at it like this. The United States doesn't pay because it doesn't have to. What are you going to do? Kick us out of the party? Probably not. And even if the UN did do that, could the United Nations ever recover financially and from a governance standpoint without the largest economy in the world being at the table? It flies in the face of the very reason the institution exists. So the list of countries that are in arrears on their dues changes every year, but it often includes countries in conflict, countries with sanctions, countries with severe economic collapse, or, as in the case, of the United States, countries whose political administrations have determined that the United Nations may not be doing the things that are in the best interest of our own national security as well as the world's security. The UN tries to work with delinquent numbers, but the financial strain is real. Now you might say, well, you've been pretty hard on the United Nations so far. You said that it does some things really well, but you've really only talked about many of the negatives so far. And that's true. But it's also true that the United Nations does some things, let's say, adequately. Okay, some things well and some things adequately. One of the things that they have traditionally been good at is humanitarian aid. When crises happen, the UN shows up. The UN agencies deliver food to more than 100 million people, vaccines to nearly half the world's children, refugee support to tens of millions, emergency relief after national disasters. Again, none of that with their own money. They use money from their operating budget, which comes from their member states, which ultimately comes from the people in those member states. The United Nations has traditionally also done a reasonable job in global health. Although I believe the WHO is broken, it has led to eradication of smallpox, near eradication of polio, global disease surveillance, and the coordination of pandemic responses, not just for COVID-19, but other pandemics as well. Although I think that we saw with COVID-19 the frailties, if not the severe gaps in the process of the United Nations in being able to deal with that. One of the United Nations traditionally strong areas has been international law. The United Nations helped establish the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Criminal Court, maritime law, and treaties on genocide, torture, and refugees. Again, all of these are laudable. But again, the United Nations has virtually no authority to enforce those. This treaty on genocide, did it stop genocide? No. The treaty on torture, did it stop torture? No. The treaties on refugees, did it slow the refugee population? Did it provide refugees with more rights? No. Its effectiveness is tied to the ability or the will of those of their member countries to do the right thing. Now, those areas that I've outlined where the United Nations has been typically strong, they're laudable, all of them, and need to be areas of coordination. But the United Nations has also failed in very many efforts. And this is the harder part. Because their failures have not just been one-offs. They've been catastrophic. And in one area where I believe, and I think there's ample evidence to support, where the United Nations has failed dramatically and catastrophically in some cases, is in peacekeeping. I mean, we've seen UN peacekeepers in Liberia, Sierra Leone, Cambodia, Namibia, Kosovo, Central African Republic. You name it. They've been there. And in many cases, with unbelievable failures. In Rwanda, for instance, in 1994, peacekeepers were present, but they were powerless. And not only did the genocide unfold anyway, but they put peacekeepers in harm's way with no real mandate or no ability to defend either the population or themselves. It was ludicrous, really. The very reason that the United Nations exists is to, first and foremost, try to avoid, to use dialogue to help countries mitigate their conflicts diplomatically so that there aren't armed conflicts. Hasn't worked. And then when those conflicts are created, when armed conflicts happen, the United Nations takes on the role of peacekeeping, which in a very large number of cases Hasn't happened. So, where are all these people who are extolling the peacekeeping ability of the United Nations? It doesn't stop wars, and it does a terrible job in ending them. And everything in between, this peacekeeping effort, is broken. Another example of where the peacekeeping effort failed: Srebrenica in Bosnia and Herzegovina, when the UN declared safe zone was overrun and thousands of Bosniaks were exterminated. Exterminated, by the way, when UN peacekeepers, Dutch UN peacekeepers, were standing there when the Serb army and paramilitaries put Bosniaks on buses and took them to their execution. And the peacekeepers did nothing because, number one, they were loath to be able to stand up to the Serbian military and paramilitaries. And secondly, they didn't have the mandate. They couldn't get approval to do anything, even if they wanted to do something. And literally, the Dutch peacekeepers stood there and watched the people that the UN had asked them to protect be exterminated, virtually in front of their eyes. That's not just a failure. That's a catastrophic failure. In Syria, the UN Security Council was paralyzed by vetoes. And because of that, humanitarian access was limited. Inconceivable. People were talking while Syrians were dying. There were endless debates in the United Nations while Syrians were dying. But in this decade, one of the UN's biggest failures, of course, has been Ukraine. You may or may not know that in the early days of this illegal invasion by the Russians into Ukraine, which occurred, remember from our special episodes, February 24th, 2022. The United Nations Secretary General refused to allow the organization to call this an illegal invasion. He refused to allow the United Nations to call what the Russians were doing a violation of international law or a genocide. He refused to call the carnage that I saw, the aftermath of which I saw in Bucha, genocide. And not only that, the UN has done virtually nothing to end the conflict. They're on the ground there. They're providing humanitarian assistance, good for them with someone else's money, but they've done nothing to end this conflict. It's at best troubling, at worst ludicrous, because Ukrainians are dying every day. And oh, by the way, this conflict likely would never have happened at all had the UN done something when Vladimir Putin and the Russians invaded Georgia and took 20% of its territory in Ossetia and Abkhazia, invaded Syria, Afghanistan, took Crimea in part of the Donbass in Ukraine. The United Nations did nothing. NATO did nothing. They stood by and argued. Very troubling, to say the least. Among the organization's other failures, is bureaucracy and inefficiency. And this is a big one to me. Again, remember what I said. The 40 to $50 billion budget of the UN is what it is. Don't really care. As long as the countries are willing to pay it, and as long as the people within those countries are in support of their countries continuing to pay the dues, fine. But it's the way the money's spent that's a real travesty, and the bureaucracy that's associated with it. I have a very good friend who headed the UNDP, that's the United Nations Development Program in Afghanistan, who quit because she said, I can't handle the bureaucracy anymore. We're spending so much time trying to execute contracts and even getting paid ourselves that we can't even do our work. The UN's criticized for slow response times, overlapping agencies, administrative bloat, and lack of accountability. And all of that is true. I've seen it firsthand. It's not speculation. Anyone who's ever worked with the UN, which I have, and anyone who has ever observed that what's happening on the ground knows that this is true. As I said, there's bureaucracy, there's soul-sucking bureaucracy, and then there's UN bureaucracy, which takes the whole thing to a level that you can't even fathom. Another failure, Security Council gridlock. The veto power of the Security Council's permanent members, which are the United States, Russia, China, France, and the UK, often prevent action. This is what happened in Ukraine, it happened in Syria, it happened in Georgia. The permanent members were divided, and it only takes one veto to scuttle the process. And guess who has a veto on Ukraine? Russia. Think about that. This is insanity times 3. That you have the country who has caused a war, who has illegally invaded another sovereign nation, who, by the way, was a peace-loving nation, not bothering anyone, simply wanting to join the EU and join NATO. You have a country invade a sovereign nation, and you can't do anything about it because they have a veto power on the Security Council. Unbelievable. And yet this is how the UN works. And by the way, those large countries like the US, Russia, China, France, UK, they are so large, they wield authority within the United Nations. And so many of the United Nations department heads, the General Secretary, they have obligations. They're beholden to those large members, of which Russia is one. So if these great powers disagree, the UN can't move. And it certainly hasn't moved. So where does the UN go from here? We've talked about some of its successes. We've talked about some of its failures. We've talked about its source of income. Where does it go from here? Our world is facing, whether you agree or not, climate change, mass migration, cyber threats, pandemics, and rising authoritarianism. By the way, all of which the United Nations was created to try to address, or at least the core issues that cause these things it was meant to address, hasn't done that. And so the same issues continue to arise. Nuclear proliferation is another one, though not as significant as it was during the Cold War. It's obvious that no single country can handle these alone, so the UN remains the only global forum where every nation, big or small, has a seat at the table. And supposedly, they have an equal seat at the table, except on the Security Council, where it's these large powers. But again, the same thing that supposedly makes the UN strong, meaning every member nation has an equal vote, can also be its undoing because it's paralysis by analysis. And the more money the UN receives, the more layers of bureaucracy it has, the more political machinations there are in the building, and the less effective it becomes. It's like cancer eating away from the inside. So the UN's future depends on stable funding, because they don't have any money unless it's provided by the member states, the reform of the Security Council, greater transparency, stronger peacekeeping mandates, and modernized bureaucracy. In some cases, the United Nations simply doesn't get it. Let me give you an example. The country of Georgia. The United Nations Development Program in the country of Georgia is very big into support of gender equality, issues like LGBTQ. I'm not denigrating these issues. There's certainly, depending on what side of the political spectrum you're on, there's certainly important issues. Everyone wants to make sure that marginalized individuals and communities have all the rights that they can have. Okay? But in focusing in these areas, it's like fiddling while Rome burns. The Georgian government has basically gone to the dark side. They've gone to the Russians, right under the nose of the United Nations. And the UNDP is doing nothing to prevent that. As a matter of fact, the programs that they're instituting are like a drop in the ocean of what needs to happen in a country like Georgia. Because both the organization as a whole and those implementing on the ground in Georgia through UNDP and other agencies are, I'll give them the benefit of the doubt, either powerless, or if they don't get the benefit of the doubt, unwilling to address the real issues. So, is the UN still relevant? Oh, this is an interesting question. It hangs over every conversation about the United Nations and has for years. And every time I ask this question, I get accused of being cynical or being a curmudgeon. It's not a cynical question. It's a necessary question. Not only from the standpoint of heads of state should be asking this question, but from the standpoint of accountability to the people in the United Nations member countries. Is the UN still relevant? Are the dues that these countries are paying buying what they need to buy and making an impact in the world as the United Nations was constructed to do? Remember, the United Nations was created to prevent war, to promote human rights, and to foster cooperation. But the world in 2026 looks very different from the world in 1945. Power has shifted. New threats have emerged. And the UN structure, especially the Security Council, reflects a geopolitical map that no longer exists. So let's break this down in trying to answer the question of whether the UN is still relevant. First of all, there's a bureaucracy problem. As I said, the UN is enormous. It has dozens of agencies. It has tens of thousands of staff. It has layers of oversight, committees, subcommittees, and working groups. And bureaucracy, by its nature, slows things down. In some cases, not just slows them down, but stops them in their tracks. Critics, like me, argue that decisions take too long, agencies overlap, administrative costs are too high, inflation is, or innovation rather, is stifled, and accountability is inconsistent. Look at the crises around the world. Many of these crises require quick movement, like COVID-19, for instance, pandemic, cyber attacks, sudden conflicts. The UN often struggles to respond because they're not built for speed. These conflicts need decisions made in real time, in quick order, and they need the issues addressed in real time and in quick order. Turning the United Nations is not like turning a speedboat. It's like turning an aircraft carrier. It takes a long time. And then, of course, in addition to the bureaucracy, the United Nations has a politics problem. The UN is supposedly a neutral actor. It's a stage where nations pursue their interest in a collective way. And nowhere is this clearer than on the Security Council, where the permanent members hold veto power. That veto power, as I said, has blocked action in Syria, paralyzed responses in Ukraine, stalled resolutions on Gaza, prevented accountability in Myanmar. When great powers disagree, the UN cannot act, full stop. There's not a comma there, there's a period. In fact, there's an exclamation point. So, in addition to the bureaucracy, addition to the structural problems that, like the Security Council and the political machinations that come with that, there's also a relevance question. Is the UN obsolete? My belief is not exactly. Does it have flaws? Numerous flaws. And I've outlined many of those in this podcast. But despite its flaws, what other organization out there can step into that role? The EU? No. In fact, the EU is that the soul-sucking bureaucracy piece of what I was talking about earlier. It has its own issues, and it's only focused on what is best for the member states of the European Union. What about President Trump's Board of Peace? Is it a substitute for the UN? Not currently, and likely not in the foreseeable future. We're not even sure yet what this Board of Peace is designed to do. So the UN is there, and it's likely not going anywhere. It'll have to get smaller. Hopefully, it'll change its mandate. But again, it's had decades to change its mandate. It's had decades to address these issues. These issues I'm talking about are not new. There's been criticism for years. They've done nothing to address them. They've done nothing to address the issues within their own building in the headquarters in New York to make themselves more relevant. So despite its flaws, the UN remains the world's largest humanitarian coordinator, the backbone of refugee protection, a leader in global health, a platform for diplomacy, a source of international law, a stabilizing force in fragile states. But it's also true that the UN can't stop wars between major powers. And it does an insufficient job of keeping the peace or in negotiating an end to those wars. I mean, just look how it mangled the peace accords in Bosnia and Herzegovina. which has damaged the country exponentially. No issue for the Cyprus question. No issue for the illegal annexation of land in Ossetia and Abkhazia and Georgia. No issue for Crimea or the Donbass. Literally no authority to stop wars. Very little, very marginal track record of peacekeeping. And I would say a good solid D minus in negotiating an end to wars. It also can't override national sovereignty. It can't enforce its resolutions without member support. It can make any resolution it wants. As I said before, unenforceable unless the member states decide to enforce them. And it cannot reform itself without the consent of the very countries that benefit from the status quo. So the UN is relevant, I think, but still very, very limited. It's necessary, regardless of my joke about UN standing for unnecessary. I do believe it's necessary, but it's very much constrained. It's ambitious, but it's also hamstrung by its own design. The path forward for the UN, in my mind, is they've got to reform the Security Council. They've got to streamline bureaucracy. They've got to be more predictable in securing funding. They've got to have stronger peacekeeping mandates. They've got to have greater transparency. They've got to have modernized structures that reflect today's geopolitical realities. And yet none of that is likely to happen because that's not new information. They've done nothing in the past to address these areas. And their ability, because of their structure, because of their bureaucracy, because of the political machinations that go on within the organization, they're likely not to be able to address them in the future. Understand my heart here. I'm not piling onto the UN for any political purpose or just because I can. The UN's not failing because its idea is flawed. It's a very laudable idea that countries should have a forum to work out their differences. It's failing because politics and bureaucracy have overwhelmed its purpose. It's like anything else. It started in a very laudable, necessary way in 1945. But it's devolved into what my beautiful mother from Oklahoma would have called a hot mess. And that tension between mission and machinery is defining the challenge of the UN's future. This can be seen through just a look at the history of their secretary generals. I mean, when we talk about the United Nations, we often focus on the institution, the Security Council, the peacemakers, the agencies, but the UN also has a face, a voice, a conscience, and that's the Secretary General. Over the last 8 decades, these men have carried the impossible burden of trying to keep the world from tearing itself apart. Today, I want to take you just on a very quick tour through these Secretary Generals. The first Secretary General of the United Nations was Trygve Lie of Norway. He was Secretary General from 1946 to 1952. He had some successes. He laid the foundation for the United Nations, their basic administrative machinery, and oversaw its move from London to New York, turning a charter into a functioning institution. He also had success in post-war reconstruction and refugees. He pushed the UN into early work on refugees and reconstruction of Europe, backing agencies that would evolve as core in today's humanitarian system. But This first Secretary General also had failures, such as Cold War paralysis. He struggled to keep the UN relevant as the Cold War heart. The Security Council was frequently deadlocked, and his open criticism of the Soviet Union led Moscow to demand his resignation. There were also Korean War tensions. His support for UN action in Korea cemented perceptions, especially in the East, that the UN was too aligned with Western interests. He was followed by the Swede, Dag Hammarskjöld, from 1953 to 1961. Hammarskjöld's successes were in defining the independent Secretary General. Hammarskjöld expanded the idea that the Secretary General could act independently of the great power dictates, using quote unquote good offices to mediate the crisis in the Middle East, Suez, and elsewhere. He also had success in peacekeeping innovation. Under his leadership, the UN developed modern peacekeeping, lightly armed troops under UN command deployed with consent, most notably in the Suez crisis and early Congo operations, where the peacekeepers were effective. But he had failures as well. In Congo, his bold intervention, including authorizing a force to prevent secession, was controversial and seen by some as overreach or neo-colonial in effect, even as others viewed it as necessary. And he had structural constraints. Hammarskjöld's death in a plane crash in 1961 froze an evolving experiment in the Secretary General activism. Many of his initiatives remained personality-driven rather than embedded structurally within the DNA of the United Nations. He was followed as Secretary General by U Thant from Myanmar from 1961 to 1971, whose successes included during the Cuban Missile Crisis, where U Thant played a quiet but crucial mediating role between Washington and Moscow, helping de-escalate the Cuban Missile Crisis through back-channel diplomacy. He also succeeded in areas such as decolonization and development, where he presided over a UN rapidly filling with newly independent states, giving greater prominence to development, anti-colonialism, and non-aligned movement concerns. But his failures were setbacks in the Middle East. U Thant's decision to withdraw a UN emergency force from Sinai in 1967 under Egyptian pressure removed the buffer just before the Six-Day War, widely criticized as a grave miscalculation. Also, Vietnam War frustration. Despite his attempts at mediation, he was unable to move the United States or North Vietnam toward a UN-brokered peace, exposing the limits of the United Nations' influence over the great power wars. He was followed by the iconic Kurt Waldheim from Austria, who was Secretary General from 1972 to 1981. Waldheim had some successes as well, like managing a turbulent decade. Waldheim kept the institution functioning through oil shocks, decolonization, aftershocks, intensifying of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and maintaining a basic level of diplomatic engagement. He also had success in institutional continuity. He oversaw the expansion of the UN specialized agencies and development programs, even as political tensions grew. Although one could argue this laid the foundation for this bureaucratic machine that's now taken over the United Nations. But Waldheim had failures as well. He was perceived as very passive. He was criticized greatly for being overly cautious and bureaucratic, more of a manager than a moral or political leader. And, of course, he was tied to past revelations within the Nazi Party. After his UN tenure, revelations about his World War II record in the German Army unit implicated in war crimes badly tarnished his legacy, and by association raised questions about the United Nations vetting and moral authority. Waldheim was followed as Secretary General by Javier Pérez de Cuellar from Peru from 1982 to 1991, who succeeded in guiding the UN through the end of the Cold War. Pérez de Cuellar presided over late Cold War thaw, helping broker peace processes in Central America such as El Salvador, Nicaragua, Afghanistan, and Namibia. He also had a quiet diplomatic style. His understated, legalistic approach suited a moment when superpowers were finally willing to compromise and the UN could reemerge as a mediator. But he had failures as well, such as the Iran-Iraq war. While the UN eventually helped secure a ceasefire, it was slow and largely reactive. The organization struggled to constrain the use of chemical weapons to protect civilians. And structural underreach. Many of his diplomatic gains depended on superpower convergence rather than UN leverage, highlighting how contingent UN success can be over external politics. Perez de Cuellar was succeeded as Secretary General by the Egyptian Boutros Ghali. Love to say that, Boutros Ghali, from 1992 to 1996. His successes were an agenda for peace. Boutros Ghali articulated an ambitious vision for preventative diplomacy, peacekeeping, and post-conflict peace building in the early post-Cold War era, expanding the conceptual toolbox of the UN. He also had success in peace operations surge. Under his watch, the United Nations peacekeeping expanded dramatically in scope and number, including missions in Cambodia, Mozambique, and El Salvador that are often cited as relative successes. But he had failures in peacekeeping in Somalia, Rwanda, and Bosnia. And these were not just failures, they were cataclysmic, catastrophic failures. Of UNISOM in Somalia, which didn't prevent the 1994 or didn't prevent the conflict from escalating there, the inability to prevent the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, and the fall of Srebrenica in Bosnia, where mandates, resources, and political will were fatally misaligned. Also, he presided over the US-UN clash. His assertiveness and criticism of great power double standards led to a breakdown with Washington. The United States blocked his second term, underscoring how dependent the Secretary General remains on these big five powers. He was succeeded by the iconic Kofi Annan from 1997 to 2006. Kofi Annan had success in human rights, in creating the Millennium Development Goals. He championed those goals, giving the UN a clear, measurable development agenda that shaped global policy and aid flows and aided aid flows. And of course, he won the Nobel Prize, which he jointly, as Secretary General and the United Nations, was awarded, recognizing efforts to revitalize the organization and promote a more peaceful world. But he still lived in the shadow of Rwanda and Srebrenica. Couldn't get a handle on the peacekeeping aspect. He had failures in as well in the Iraq War and the Oil for Food program, which was both ineffective and scandalous. In fact, the Oil for Food scandal further damaged the UN's reputation across the board. Kofi Annan was succeeded by Ban Ki-moon from the Republic of Korea, who was Secretary General from 2007 to 2016. He had success in climate diplomacy. He was a guiding force in the Paris Agreement in 2015, and also in developing what we call the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. He oversaw the transition of MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, to SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, broadening the agenda to include governance and environmental sustainability. But Ban Ki-moon had failures in Sri Lanka, Syria, where he was heavily criticized for muted responses to alleged war crimes in the final stages of Sri Lanka's civil war and for its limited impact in the Syrian conflict. Also, the UN was very slow to address the Haiti cholera outbreak, when UN peacekeepers actually introduced cholera to Haiti in 2010. Ban Ki-moon was followed by Antonio Guterres from Portugal, who is the current Secretary General from 2017 to now, till now. He's had successes in dealing with the refugee issue and dealing with humanitarian crises because he was former UN High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, and so he's consistently highlighted displacement, migration, and humanitarian crisis and pushed for more coherent responses. He's also done a good job in climate and prevention narrative. He has called climate change a defining issue of our time. Again, whether you believe that or not, certainly he is known as someone who has championed those issues. But he's had great failures as well. Resurgence of U.S. China Russia rivalry has constrained the room to maneuver on crisis from Myanmar to Ukraine to Gaza. The UN has often appeared sidelined or divided, with vetoes blocking robust action. And he's very cautious. Guterres has been too cautious in publicly confronting powerful states on human rights abuses, reflecting an enduring tension between access and advocacy. So, what's the pattern underneath these personalities? Across these 10 years, a pattern emerges. There have been successes, but these successes tend to cluster where the Secretary General can leverage moments of great power and convergence, where relatively permissive environments exist or agenda-setting opportunities exist, such as the MDGs and SDGs. The failures often come when mandates are ambitious, but resources and political backing are thin, like in Somalia, Rwanda, Bosnia, Sri Lanka, Syria, and Ukraine. Or where permanent member states decide to act unilaterally, as they did in Iraq. So, where does this leave us? It leaves us with this. The United Nations is imperfect. It's political. It's slow. It's frustrating. But it's also one of humanity's most ambitious attempts to solve problems together rather than alone. Its actions have saved millions of lives, again, using someone else's money. But it's indisputable that the United States has saved, or the United Nations, rather, has saved millions of lives. It's prevented conflicts. It's fed the hungry. It's sheltered the displaced. And yet it's failed on so many occasions when the world needed it most. So is the UN still relevant? At the end of the day, I'll give it a yes with a big caveat. Because it's yes, but not in the way the founders imagined. It's not a global government. It's not a world police force. It's a forum, a mirror that reflects the will, the courage, and the limitations of member states. Its future depends on whether we choose cooperation over isolation, reform over stagnation, and shared responsibility over national silos. Its future depends really on itself. Is there the will for the United Nations to change, to reform itself, to revert to what it was meant to be instead of what it is? I wish I knew the answer. I wish I could tell you that the will was there. My suspicion is that it's not. And that will leave the world continually debating whether or not the United Nations continues to be relevant. Hope you've learned something on this episode. Hope you've enjoyed it. And I hope you'll join us next time on Some Stops Along the Way. Every Monday morning at 8 a.m. Eastern Time in the U.S., a new episode drops on Spotify and YouTube. Hit like, hit subscribe, and talk it up among your friends and have them tune in as well. We'll see you next Monday on Some Stops Along the Way.